to share a little bit about the approach to dealing with the rationality of faith that I've developed in some, at this time, not so recent books anymore, but 2015 books titled Rationality as Virtue and Theological Philosophy. So I'll definitely get to that question of the rationality of faith later in the talk, but I really want to start out initially by thinking about the nature of rationality in general. As I'm going to explain, I think it's important to think about rationality not merely as a kind of epistemological question to do with how thinking works and the soundness of our thinking. This is an important part of rationality, which I'll also discuss, definitely. But I'd like to suggest that we should also consider rationality as an ethical question to do with whether we use our knowledge to lead lives that are consistent with the overarching purpose that we have as rational animals. This purpose, which I gather is also a concern of the Zephyr Institute, involves flourishing as the individuals that we are, discovering and using the abilities that we have, and through that contributing to the flourishing of others. This ethical or moral understanding of rationality is perhaps a bit unusual in the current context, but it's useful in my view for addressing the question of the rationality of faith, which is often undermined when we work in light of other modern ideas of rationality. Of course, there are many such ideas, and I would not by any means want to deny the variety and complexity and sophistication as well of different theories of rationality in circulation today. But for the purposes of my talk and the question of the rationality of faith, it does help to start from the assumption that rationality in this context is often construed in a way that renders it in terms of the objectivity of our knowledge and whether our ideas correspond to reality. In recent years, a number of philosophers, by the way, is the traffic noise bothering anybody? Okay, fantastic. In recent years, a number of philosophers have called attention to a range of problems with this way of thinking about rationality as sort of correspondence between ideas and reality. First of all, there's a question about how to account for what some call the embodied nature of our knowing, the fact that our knowledge is shaped by the context in which we live in space and time, and by our own specific abilities and interests. How can we know if our ideas correspond to reality when the reality we encounter varies and our own experience of reality is limited? Furthermore, how can we account for the fact that as human beings, we're always learning? Because of this aspect of our existence, our knowledge is never an all or nothing affair, but it's a matter of gradually increasing our understanding of anything that we're trying to know. In recent philosophical history, there have been a number of attempts to account for these aspects of human knowledge in a way that nonetheless affirms the human capacity to be rational. Many of these are really helpful in my opinion, but for the purposes of my larger project of rethinking the rationality of faith, I've tried to contribute to that project of rethinking the nature of rationality in general by defining knowledge itself in terms of faith. And of course, here I'm not thinking of faith in a specifically religious sense, but just faith in a sort of generic way as involving kind of belief in something that's unknown. So as I hope to make clear in the course of the talk, I've drawn heavily, but nonetheless creatively, on the intellectual tradition of the great medieval thinker Thomas Aquinas in order to develop these ideas. Aquinas held a view of rationality that arguably didn't even give rise to the question of the rationality of faith, at least in our modern sense of the question. In that sense, his views on the nature of rationality in general seem useful to me in terms of the project of rethinking the nature of rationality in a way that's more compatible with the rationality of faith. So on the account of rationality that I tried to develop, knowledge transpires in 3 different phases that all involve some kind of faith. So the first phase is expectant faith, and that's the phase where we pose a question or realize that we have a desire for understanding. I want to know this or that. And this desire leads us to go out in search of that understanding and try and find an answer. Fulfilled faith is when we find the answer to our question, possibly after a very long and laborious search for understanding. And anyone who's doing a PhD probably can relate to this whole treacherous process of searching for understanding. And informed faith is when we use or perhaps even put faith in the answers that we've come across in order to generate new questions and search for new answers in what's really ultimately an ongoing search for understanding that's always increasing. Obviously, it's impossible when you think of knowledge along these lines to obtain knowledge that's true for all people at all places at all times, because on this account, our knowledge is always evolving. It always involves faith. But medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas invoked another way of accounting for what we might think of as the rationality or objectivity of our knowledge. And this involves what they described as the desire or the will for knowledge, which is involved at every single stage in the knowing process. So, for example, at the stage of expectant faith, the will is what gives rise to an interest in a given question and gives us the desire to explain something that we don't understand as yet. In the lead up to fulfilled faith, the will gives us the motivation to do the work involved in finding an answer. For example, in the 3 years that you're working on your PhD dissertation, and it's hard slogging at some points. And finally, in the context of informed faith, the will is what compels us to apply any understanding we've achieved in order to make sense of new experiences and generate new questions. So it's really because the role that will plays in guiding understanding that we're able to grow in knowledge. That said, there are a lot of ways in which the will for knowledge can go a bit astray and bring about hindrances to understanding. For instance, if I have a hypothesis or a theory about how to answer a particular question and I want to defend it at all costs, or I'm under some sort of external pressure to defend it, I may gloss over relevant data that undermines my thesis in order to achieve my desired epistemic outcome. According to someone like Aquinas, these kind of issues arise because of the constant interplay between the will for knowledge and what he calls the passions. And the passions are sort of immediate reactions that we have to our experiences or objects of knowledge, in which we find them either pleasurable or painful. And the difficult thing for us as human beings is always to take pleasure in the right things and to be pained by the right things. We have a tendency instead to take pleasure in the wrong things, for example, promoting our thesis no matter the cost, or to be pained by the wrong things, such as having to put forth effort in order to obtain knowledge, or having our views contested or disproved by others, for example. The job of the will, if it does its job well, is to counteract this tendency to prefer what's sort of easiest, not painful and pleasurable in the moment, in order to obtain what's really best and most important overall, in this case, the truth. But the will arguably needs certain qualities in order to perform this function. In recent years, a number of philosophers have begun to describe these qualities in terms of intellectual virtues, though they don't always agree on what the virtues exactly are and what function they perform. I have found it really useful to think about the four virtues in terms of those that have been identified by Thomas Aquinas and many other medieval thinkers. And these include prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Although these virtues are normally described as moral virtues, it's relatively easy to kind of infer an intellectual role that they can play in knowledge on the basis of the functions that are generally ascribed to them. For example, prudence is generally described as the virtue of the intellect, which is concerned with knowing the truth. Justice is a virtue associated with the will that compels us to prioritize the search for truth over any other considerations, such as what may be easiest or most desirable for us in the moment. Fortitude deals with our passions, as does temperance. And in particular, fortitude helps us with those passions that generate feelings of pain or discomfort, while temperance is the virtue that helps us deal appropriately with feelings that involve pleasure or happiness. These two virtues help us regulate our passions or desires for knowledge so that we have the best possible chance of achieving the most accurate information available to us at any time, albeit in light of our personal limitations and our abilities to obtain knowledge. So together, in other words, fortitude and temperance help us fulfill the purpose of intellect and will, or prudence and justice, which is simply to know what is true. For instance, fortitude gives us the courage to keep seeking truth, even when it's challenging or discouraging and we're not finding answers to our questions. And temperance gives us the discipline to search for the truth when we might be tempted to just give up on it or distracted with other things. Although new experiences or information may contest the things we have taken to be true in the past, the importance of the virtues consists in the fact that they help us to remain open to that new information and ready to adapt and update our views at any point in time. And that's the sense in which they are essential to our rationality. But so far, I've only been talking about rationality in a purely intellectual sense, or as it concerns our knowledge or intellectual virtue. That's certainly important, but as I've suggested, it's not the only sense in which we might want to think about rationality. After all, human beings are not brains in a vat, and for us to be rational doesn't seem reducible to questions about the objectivity of our knowledge. Rather, knowledge and ideas are the means by which we realize our potential as human beings and thus help others to do the same. As this suggests, the larger context for the pursuit of intellectual virtue entails the pursuit of moral virtue. And that's not to say that the two kinds of virtue are unable to exist independently. Aquinas himself admitted that there are many who are exceptionally intellectually virtuous. They are geniuses in one way or another, but don't have a particular concern for questions of morality or their own morality. Likewise, there are lovely, moral, generous, wonderful people who perhaps don't devote a whole lot of time to questions, to scientific questions, to questions of intellectual virtue, if you want. Although it's in principle possible to have intellectual without moral virtue or vice versa, it seems to me that in optimal circumstances, the pursuit of rationality in the field of knowledge, whatever we do with our capacities for thinking, will be ordered towards a larger question of how we can be rational or virtuous in an ethical or moral sense, how we can comport ourselves in the world in a way that's beneficial to ourselves, that realizes our personal potential and helps others to do the same. To cultivate moral virtue in this way is the ultimate purpose or rationale behind being rational in the purely intellectual sense. And so arguably, cultivating moral virtue is what it means to be rational in the fullest sense of the term. Of course, here in the moral, as in the intellectual context, our passions pose a threat to our rationality, defined in terms of virtue. Prudence, again, that virtue of the intellect that seeks to know the truth, in this case has to know the truth about ourselves. And in that sense, it has to counteract a tendency that we have as human beings to sort of over or underestimate our skills, our abilities, what we're entitled to. It has to curb our attempts to be or be recognized as something more or less or other than we really are. On its part, justice has to redress our often conflicting senses of allegiance in order to help us determine how precisely we as individuals can maximize our contribution to the well-being of others. If I focus my attention in one area, then I can't devote so much attention to another. But this kind of assessment really requires a sound grasp on ourselves, on who we are, and overcoming a tendency to avoid thinking about the truth about ourselves and embracing our limitations. Fortitude gives us that courage and commitment to withstand the comfort, or if you want, pain, that these kind of admissions may involve. And temperance helps us take pleasure in and put the effort in to simply be ourselves and cultivate whatever potentials we have on a daily basis. I realize that this description of the moral virtues might all sound a bit vague, and that's because to some extent it is. We've been talking about the four virtues and how they work together, or how they should work together in any situation to help us do what is best, both for ourselves and others. But since every individual and every circumstance is different, what is best varies and has to be discerned really on a case-by-case, person-by-person basis. According to Aquinas, who was following Aristotle here, the key to discerning what is best to do in any given situation involves finding the mean, or ascribing neither more or less significance to anything than is appropriate to it. Everything in our lives has the ability to be blown out of proportion, not to be taken seriously enough. That includes our abilities, our successes, our failures, our limitations, our challenges, our sufferings, our joys, our interests, relationships, the demands on our time and our own desires. Could go on and on. But the failure to find the right balance between these different considerations is where the passions are allowed by the will to get rather out of order in ways that ultimately detract from our rationality. That's true not only in the intellectual context, but also in the larger moral context, which concerns the questions of how we conduct our lives, what we even choose to do with them in the first place. It's hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all formula for rationality in this kind of ethical sense, but I've found it helpful to think of moral virtue as a matter of bearing well whatever we have to bear in any given situation we face as human beings, in light of whatever interests, abilities, or limitations we may have. That's kind of code for finding the mean, if you want, bearing things well. In doing this, we realize and instantiate the four moral virtues and exhibit rationality in the highest sense of the term. More concretely, we realize the potential for good in our humanity and in our interactions with others, rather than the potential for harm, which we also possess, and foster the best rather than the worst possible versions of ourselves and our communities. This is the outcome I really hope to encourage in my efforts to redefine rationality as intellectual and ultimately as moral virtue. But I'd like to think that that account has some merit on its own, as an explanation not only of how we know, but also how to apply our minds to that ethical task of organizing our whole lives. But I've already suggested that this approach has another potentially useful application in that it provides a foundation for illustrating the rationality of faith. As you can imagine, it is rather difficult to prove the rationality of religious faith in a context where our ideas are expected to somehow correspond to reality, given that God, however you understand him, is generally conceived to be transcendent and thus beyond the reach of human knowledge. For that reason, attempts to prove the rationality of faith have often had to choose between one of two options. So the first option is just to acknowledge that God is beyond reason and to accept that he's real on the basis of some kind of unfounded faith. But the second option is to try to provide proofs for his existence, whether on the basis of teleology or the world he's made, or possibly even the existence of the human mind, which some people take as proof of God's existence. It hardly needs saying that these kind of proofs are not terribly likely to convince those who don't already believe in God, nor is the leap of faith a particularly satisfactory option. So debates on this topic often quickly reach an impasse. One reason why I tried to develop an account of knowledge that presupposes the vital role that something like faith plays in human reasoning, even though that faith was kind of generic and not religious, is that this suggests that faith has a kind of rational substance that's often been overlooked. While that account may provide some kind of initial, potentially fruitful grounds for thinking about the rationality of faith, I'd like to suggest there's an even more promising approach to doing so, which mirrors the role that moral virtue plays in providing an ultimate purpose or rationale for cultivating moral virtue. As I suggested earlier, it's fantastic, of course, if we're cultivating intellectual virtue and making great discoveries in science, technology, as philosophers, architects, whatever we may do. But the ideal situation will be to kind of pursue these goals and these intellectual projects in the context of questions about who am I, what am I here for, what's the best use that I can make of my life, what is the greatest contribution that I can make to society in very practical terms. So in a kind of similar way to the way in which moral virtue provides a rationale or context, if you want, a purpose for intellectual virtue, we could say that faith provides a rationale for rationality in the moral sense of the term. And this, of course, is a very much debated topic, so it'll be great to hear your questions. But anyway, I noted earlier that rationality in this moral sense involves exhibiting those four virtues, which together enable us to strike the mean between excess and deficiency in our ordinary lives, and thus to bear the circumstances of our lives to the best of our abilities. To do this is arguably to strive for the highest good that we can achieve within the confines of our existence. In many respects, that highest good, that attempt to bear things well in our own lives, can also be defined as the common good, since what's best for ourselves, or bearing ourselves well, involves realizing our potential to do something in this world which does or ought to hopefully contribute to the benefit of society, which itself creates the need and the context for whatever we might contribute to it. But I've already hinted that the highest or the common good is not an easy one to achieve in a world where we're always dealing with competing priorities and demands on our attentions, as well as conflicting desires within our own selves. This raises the question, how is it possible for us to navigate the complex circumstances of our lives and strike the mean or do what is best in every situation? The view of someone like Thomas Aquinas was that we need to acknowledge some transcendent being as the highest good, which is above and beyond all the competing and conflicting considerations of our existence, or temporal goods, if you want, in order to know how to prioritize those goods in relation to one another. Of course, Aquinas had in mind the God of Christian faith, and he had a variety of reasons for wanting to sign up to a particular understanding of God, which could be elaborated, but I think I'll keep it in somewhat more general terms today. The good, if you want to think of it as transcendent, whether it's Christian or whether it's another kind of idea of the transcendent or God that you're working with is presumably beyond any good we can know in the world, and therefore never knowable in itself. But Aquinas would say that applying the belief in God or the transcendent as a highest good that exceeds all ordinary goods in the context of our deliberations about ordinary goods helps us to bear them well. And doing that illustrates the power that belief in the transcendent, the highest good, can have in terms of rendering us rational. And that is the sense in which belief itself is rational, because it, in a way, provides a rationale for rationality, contributes to that project of helping us to figure out how to bear things well. In the Aristotelian ethical framework that Aquinas presupposes, it is better to have a kind of rationale for rationality than it is to simply be rational without having such a rationale. And the reason for that is that it's difficult to achieve any goal that you don't deliberately aim for or know how to aim for. So for example, it would be hard for me to speak French unless I've studied French and practiced French. Even if I did somehow manage to say a few words in French without realizing that I'd done so, maybe just by repeating something I heard on the radio, my success would be accidental and probably therefore not something that was repeatable. Without a rationale or an explanation for how I did what I did, a knowledge of French grammar, for example, I would not be able to teach others how I did what I did or even correct my own errors. So in all these respects, one might argue that we need a rationale for anything we do, and that includes our efforts to serve the highest good. And that belief in such a good, which cannot by definition be reduced to any of the kinds of goods that are the object of our consideration, provides an important resource or rationale for doing this. At the same time, however, a lot of theologians in recent years have acknowledged that the resources of belief in God, Christian or otherwise, which are supposed to facilitate our rationality, can themselves become the subject of skewed priorities. And this can easily happen precisely because religious beliefs and practices are matters that tend to be taken seriously. And they can be taken so seriously that affirming and defending a particular approach to religious belief or religious practice can become more important than realizing our own potential or helping others do the same. Or religion can even cease to become about those matters at all. So when that happens, religious belief can become a hindrance to rationality or moral virtue, to such an extent that we might even say that it's better or even easier to exhibit the substance of moral virtue, the height of rationality, if one isn't beholden to a specific rationale. At the end of the day, I'd like to suggest we might think of the purpose of being human as simply to do the work of bearing the circumstances of our daily lives to the best of our ability, and in this limited way to achieve the highest good that we can within the confines of our own existence. One thing I've hoped to have highlighted in this talk today is just how easy it is to lose sight of that good, and how important it is to have some mechanism for helping ourselves avoid the tendency to lose sight of what we're here for. For some, that may be belief in God. For others, it may simply be the pursuit of the highest good, the good of ourselves and others for its own sake. That is ultimately, I think, what's most important, and I'm really delighted again to have had the chance to share with you all as a group that's working towards these ends.